So for today's question, let's talk about what's the difference between captains and leaders. I do think a lot of people think these things, these two titles, these two positions are the same, and they're absolutely not. And they will make a huge influence in your organization and your team if you don't manage the possible differences between the two. So let me back up and first talk about big picture. I believe culture is king. If you're a coach, you're a pastor, you're a leader, any organization, you got your own business, doesn't really matter. Culture is king. And when I talk about culture, I'm talking about just the way your organization does business, the way your team functions. And so it's the last great advantage, certainly in sports. It's the last great advantage, meaning any offense, hot new defense, special teams, whatever it may be, every scheme is going to end up on film and can be emulated. It's going to be broken down. Somebody's going to clinic it, and we can always emulate what you do schematically. Every practice plan, every technique, all those things can be imitated. Okay, but your culture cannot be. Every culture is unique, and so your culture could be a big disadvantage for you, or it can be what I consider the last great advantage because it can be emulated. So you as a coach, your job is to cast your vision, make your organization, make your team look like you want it to look, you want it to function, and that's all culture. And so culture is king. And so captains are typically people or players who are public representations of your leadership. So these are people that maybe players in your team that's going to be talking to the officials. There may be if a media outlet wanted to interview a player, there may be typically the players that would communicate with media. Um, to go out there before the coin toss, those type of things, maybe do the speaking at a pep rally. That they are the public representations of your team, and many times they're selected because of their consistent display of doing business the way you, as the leader, want them to do. So they're typically your great examples of what you want your program to look like, what you want players to look like. And so oftentimes they're the oldest members of your team. And so, I know some teams go through interview process. Some teams, the coaches select them. Some teams, the players vote on it, or maybe some combination of the two. But what I would say, the captains have the title, and they're going to publicly represent you as the coach. Okay. That does not necessarily mean they are a leader. Okay. And so, I think about a player previously on a previous team that was everything that I wanted him to be from a, work standpoint, attitude standpoint. But the kid was a very much an introvert. And so the players, even though they voted for him to be a captain because he was a senior, he did everything the right way. Player, is kind of one of those things where I think people feel like it's owed to him, but he was not a leader. He had zero influence on anybody on that team, certainly not in a significant way, even though he was selected as a captain. When I think about captains, I think about titles. When I think about leaders, I think about power. So leaders are the private influencers in your locker room. So while the captains are your public influence, your public representatives to your leadership, the leaders, they're the people who maybe are influencing your locker room behind the scenes. And so they may not have a title, but what they say has a lot of influence with a lot of people in your organization. So I've even heard about this in a church where a pastor Was just hired, new pastor, young pastor, taking over kind of an older church, and he's having his first meeting with the elder board, and he's casting his vision. And that elder board, the majority of the elder board, just through body language, um, he got the sense that they might have been on board. But some other body language that he noticed is that they seem to be deferring to one particular person on that elder board. And so what that pastor quickly realized is um, there's a lot of captains in this room, but there's really only one leader. There's one person who everybody will defer to, and so he's the real influencer in the room. And so that pastor understood that, and he knew the appropriate steps to take. And so let's talk about that. What's like when you figure that out, who your influencers are, they may or may not be your captains. What do you do about it? Okay, so if culture is king, you better have influence on the people who influence your culture. I'm going to say that again. If the culture is really the king, and your job, you're trying to cast your vision, you're trying to make this team look like this picture in your head that you've been hired to implement, um, you better have influence on the people who are influencing your culture. Okay. And so it would be great if the captains were always the leaders, and they probably should be, but that's, that perfect scenario I think rarely happens. Um, and even if it does happen, your three captains, your two captains, your four captains could be leaders, but it doesn't mean that there's other leaders in your organization who is having influence. So you have to find a way. I think big picture, I'm going to give a couple practical things, but you better understand how this is working, and then you can come up with your own ways of how to influence the people who influence your culture. So one way that a lot of programs do, this is not anything new. What do you do when your captains are not your leaders? I think expand your leadership. Maybe you have captains, but you have a players' council or a leaders' council. I know for me, I'm a football coach. We have a bigger team, just the nature of that sport, so we can have more leaders. So at times we'd have 12 members on the leadership council, and so 4 of those guys were captains. But the other 8 was just guys who we felt like were leaders and influencers, the private influencers of the program. And so I think the mistake that coaches make when they do leadership councils is they're using the same criteria that they use for captains. So I hear coaches will have, all their seniors are a leadership council. Well, we all know in most programs, every senior is not a leader, it's not an influencer. Most of them are followers. Okay, they've been in your program the longest, but there may be some juniors, there may be some sophomores, some other people who have more influence, or one problem with seniors being all the leaders is they typically have influence on each other, and they have this culture that they've built with each other, but they may not have those relationships with juniors and sophomores and freshmen. And so it may be wise to not just select it based on who's been in the program the longest, but you as a coach trying to figure out like who are actually the influencers. So for me, for one, I always in my captains, I've always had a underclassman. I never picked all seniors. I always wanted an underclassman there. And in our leadership council, we always had several underclassmen on that leadership council because we just wanted the influencer. So if we picked the right 12, I mean for me it was 12 in a program of 100 guys or so. If I picked the right 12, then I had a chance to influence every area of the program, and that's really was the goal for me, trying to influence all the people who can have influence on our program, and that gave me a better chance to create the culture that I was trying to create. The second idea, there may be times that certain people that you just can't put them on the leadership council. Maybe they're great football players, great athletes, great players, or whatever sport, but there's something about them or their character or their influence on other people that they shouldn't have that title. Because leadership council is a title. Okay, maybe they shouldn't have that um, because of its influence on other people. Okay, if but if that person, or if you have people in your organization who you can't put on the council, but they still have an influence in different parts of your organization, then you have to build a one-on-one relationship with them. And that relationship may be much more important than some other relationships. So it's obviously important. You want to have great relationships with all of your players, but you better have relationship with the influencers in your locker room. So who are the private influencers of your culture? You got to find a way to have relationship with them, cast vision, um, buddy up, keep casting vision, keep trying to get them on board because they will have influence behind the scenes. So that's the bottom line. The difference between captains and leaders is captains a lot of times is titles. Leaders is always power or influence. And so although you want them both to be the same, for you as the leader of the program, you better make sure you focus on the leaders, not the public, although that's important, but the people who are going to have more influence on your program and whether it looks like the vision that you wanted are going to be the leaders. And they may not have a title. And so influence the influencers of your culture. And that's going to take you a long way.